Okay, I show 4 p.m. Eastern, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you. Oh, could you go back a slide, please, Andrew? I'd like to welcome you to the NGSS webinar, Thinking Scientifically in a Changing World. We'd just like to remind everyone to make sure that your microphone is muted and your video is off. If you need to get our attention, you can click in the participants box and raise your hand. We'll also be using the chat feature a few times this evening. If you have questions that you would like, please please put them in the chat and we'll address them at certain points in the webinar as well as at the end. This webinar is a collaboration between the American Geosciences Institute Center for Geoscience and Society, the National Association of Geoscience Teachers, and the National Earth Science Teachers Association. Next slide, please. This webinar is being recorded. The organizers of this webinar are Aida Wad, who is the past president of NAGT, and Ed Robeck, who is with the American Geosciences Institute, myself, Carla McAuliffe, the executive director of NESTA, and Andrew House at CERC and NAGT, who's our technical support. We have this webinar series happens roughly once a month. We do have a couple webinars actually in May. The next one is going to be presented by Steve Curlin from the Stroud Water Research Center, and that's on Wiki Watersheds, and that is April 18th at 4 p.m. Eastern. Normally we're the second Thursday of the month, but we shifted this one due to the National Science Teachers Association meeting happening in St. Louis. If you missed a previous webinar, you can always view the archived versions at this link here. When we are done with the webinar, Andrew will post the recording as well as the PowerPoint slides to the webinar page so you can access this link. And with that, I will pass it over to Doug Lombardi at Temple University and Donna Governor at the University of North Georgia, who are going to give us this presentation, and I'll let them introduce themselves as they bring up their slides.
Okay, thank you, Carl. I'm going to share my screen. And I just want to say hello to everybody and thank you for coming. My name is Doug Lombardi and I'm here at Temple University. And I'm the principal investigator for a project called the MEL Project. And I'm joined today by Donna Governor, who's one of our co-investigators on the project. She's from the University of North Georgia. And I should note that Carla McAuliffe is also a co-investigator on the project in association with her role at TURC. It's a great collaboration of a lot of people involved, including we have wonderful master teachers, and our lead master teacher who's been with us the whole project is Missy Holzer, who I saw has joined the webinar. So Missy, feel free to chime in at any point. I would appreciate hearing your thoughts as well as Donna's and Carla's. This graphic here just kind of shows one of the images from our materials and various logos with the project. And now I'm going to turn it over to Donna, and Donna's going to begin the conversation.
Hey everybody, Doug, you can go ahead. There you go. Hi everybody, thanks for joining us today. I am a former classroom teacher who's only recently gone to higher education. And I did teach earth and environmental science and found that there were a lot of issues that presented problems for my students. And those were the socio-scientific issues that were really kind of controversial in some ways. One would think that they shouldn't be, but they have become, because there's a lot of information out there, including a lot of disinformation. Some of these subjects that I had to deal with sensitively with my children our students included things like climate change, fracking, extreme weather, freshwater resources, climates. All of these things were problems because kids are getting a lot of misinformation out there. There's a whole lot out there. And so getting kids to think critically about what counts as evidence and how it informs our scientific models and understandings is really, really important. So that's really where this project was of particular interest to me. Doug?
Thanks, Donna. And when we approach these kind of socio-scientific topics, especially those of a controversial nature, there's this notion, and I know all of you are on board with this, that we can't just simply treat our students like they just don't know, because they actually do know a lot of information, but they're bombarded with a lot of information, and it's difficult for them to make sense about this. This idea where students just don't know, and if we make things clear to them and present it in a certain way that they're going to understand it, is essentially incorrect. It doesn't go the full way. It's called the information deficit. And I really became aware of this kind of notion of the information deficit from this debunking handbook, which you can get available online by John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski. And what we need to understand as teachers and educators is how people think about information, how they modify the knowledge that they have from their experiences, and how their worldviews affect their ability to think and how it shapes how they reason. So what we try to do in the MEL project is go beyond that. And we build upon the framework of K-12 science education, which was published by the National Academies of Science in 2012. And that framework served as the basis for the next generation science standards, which is the topic of this webinar series. And I've basically tried to boil down kind of this notion of scientific literacy into kind of two components. It's not only what scientists know, it's not just the facts or the science content, but it's how scientists know what they know. It's essentially how they construct their explanations about these phenomena that they observe and how they reason and think about data. And one of the things that helps me when I think about how scientists do their daily activities is this image from the framework of K-12 science education. And this image is really interesting. It's got, they call 3 spheres of activity here: investigating, evaluating, and developing explanations and solutions. And even though they're not really spherical, they're kind of columns in this nature. But the one that we focus on in the Model Evidence Link Diagram project, we call it MEL for short, and I'll stick to that kind of nomenclature a lot, is this notion of evaluation and how evaluation is central. Evaluation is argument, critique, and analysis. And that's central to scientific thinking and how scientists construct knowledge, how they construct knowledge about our world. And so we do deal with evidence and lines of evidence that are gathered over here in the investigating arm, but we also deal heavily with the explanations, and that's really kind of the focus of the MEL project.
Because most states have either gone towards adopting NGSS or have adopted new standards based on the frameworks for K-12 education that were released in 2012, most states now have this model of 3-dimensional learning or 3-dimensional instruction, and that is looking at the disciplinary core ideas or concepts, science and engineering practices, and cross-cutting concepts. So we wanted to take a minute to basically connect what we are doing through this project to 3-dimensional learning. And depending on which of the MELs or baMELs that are used, you would work with maybe some very different content. However, where we really have focused is on the science practices and the cross-cutting concepts. And so if you think about the practices, there are 8 of them, and we could argue that they, using these instructional scaffolds, could work with multiple science and engineering practices. We really feel like that a lot of what we're doing is looking at that evaluation that Doug just talked about, and looking at having students engage in argument from evidence. We want them to see that they need to be able to connect evidence to models and make strong arguments that will allow for those connections to be made. Next slide. In terms of the cross-cutting concepts, we're looking at causality, cause and effect, and looking at those relationships between the evidence and the models and how cause and effect play into that. So we wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit about this three-dimensional framework applications before we get into much detail. So let's move on, Doug.
All right, thanks, Donna. We appreciate that as kind of a foundation. We always keep the NGSS in mind as we develop these activities and as we work with teachers and students in testing these activities in classrooms. One of the things that we found out, this is addressed in the framework and also in the NGSS, but when we think about scientists' explanations, often people think about it in terms of a plausibility judgment. You know, is the explanation plausible? Scientists particularly use that as a criterion for formulating what the best explanation is about a phenomenon. It turns out, though, that students may find many scientific explanations, particularly those that are of a socio-scientific nature, those that are controversial, those where misinformation may be out there, to be implausible. So what we deal with when we think about the plausibility judgment, again, is the focus on the explanations or the model, the explanatory model of the phenomenon. There are other cognitive judgments and evaluations that students make and all people make, but they do it often without really purposefully thinking. So what we try to do in the MEL project is get students to think purposefully about these kind of judgments that they make about scientific explanations. So like I said, plausibility is associated with scientific explanations, but there are other types of judgments that are involved associated with data and evidence. For example, credibility of the source of data. Is it an expert source? Is it a trustworthy source? There's also the reliability, which is often, these are all critical components, not something we deal with per se in the model evidence link diagram, although it's kind of implicit within the framework of the lines of evidence that we introduce. And we'll be talking about that in a moment. But really what we get students to think purposefully about is these evaluations between lines of evidence and explanatory models and the plausibility judgment. How plausible is the explanation? And we do competing explanations. So we have a question for you, and we have a poll question. And this poll question is related to your experiences. What are some scientific explanations that your students have been found implausible? We've put a few up there. So if your students have found any of these to be implausible, just select them. You can select multiple versions, I believe. So you don't have to select just one. So let's just take a few minutes. And if you guys could, I put a couple in there that I find implausible still, even though I know a lot of the science. Go ahead and we'll give it about another 15 or 20 seconds for you to read through those. All right, if we could maybe see the poll results now. Let's see what see if people have shared my experiences. Yeah, okay, so number one there is this notion of the Big Bang and the universe starting from a singularity. I still find that to be implausible too. The universe was once small on the tip of the pen. Yeah, and the light speed one, I guess that's one of the lower ones. I'm a Star Trek fan. That's why I put this image up. And I think that we'll be able to do it someday. But a lot of students find it implausible when we talk about it in physics. There's crust is in motion, a big Earth science topic. Humans are causing current climate change. I'm glad to see that there's still a lot of students that find that implausible. That's something we've been working in. I mean, I'm not glad to see that, but it does correspond to what I've been seeing. And then this notion of fresh water supply and how population may be able to not support our population with fresh water. So those are great. Thank you, everybody. All right, so let's move on. We'll do a few more slides and then we'll open up for kind of a mid-break question. But let's, Donna, I think you're up next, and let me advance. Go ahead, Donna.
Right. Thanks, Doug. So when you're dealing with evidence and reasoning, many teachers are familiar with some other instructional strategies. One of those is the claims evidence reasoning model. And in this model, students actually make a claim that is a proposed answer to a question. And it might be a claim that they made through based on an experiment or collecting data or an investigation. And then they cite specific evidence that would be used to support that claim and then connect it with justification that links the claim to the evidence. And this is a familiar instructional strategy, but some of you may have some other instructional strategies that you use. Do we have a poll for this? So
we have a poll.
So in the chat window, if you can kind of list some, there we go, there's a poll. Which instructional strategies do you use in your classroom to promote students' engagement in scientific argument? So here are some, including the CER model, debate, historical case studies, interactive role play, making inferences from observations, or other. And if you can take this poll, and we'll give you a minute to decide which of these, and you can check more than one.
And if you select other, the idea is to go into the chat box and provide us with an additional strategy.
So the claims evidence reasoning is 672% of you, yay. So it is a familiar instructional strategy. 67% of you use making inferences from observable evidence. And less common are other things like interactive role play or historical case studies and debate. No one uses another, so that's good to know. So we've gotten most of them. So what's different, if we'd like to move on about something such as claims evidence reasoning, is that claims are proposed answers to questions, where scientists really develop models. And the difference is claims are a little bit more specific, where models actually provide an explanation of a scientific phenomenon. They can be a hypothesis that lead to new questions and predict or describe how and why a particular phenomenon occurs. And for both claims and models, evidence is the total foundation, but for models, you're talking about something that's a little bit bigger. It encompasses a broader scope. So that's where we're moving from talking about claims into what we're doing with this project, which is looking at scientific models. So, and again, we can tie that into NGSS with looking at systems and system models, which is both a cross-cutting concepts as well as one of the science and engineering practices is dealing with models, systems and system models. So let's go ahead and move on.
Well, before we do that, Donna, why don't we open it up for questions? Now, I can't see the chat window, so maybe Carla or Donna, you could help me and see what some questions some people have, and we can take a stab at answering them.
Yeah, Doug, can you just make sure that you direct your voice a little bit louder and towards the microphone?
Sure. This is open for questions, and if you guys can just let me know.
Absolutely. So one thing that I noticed in there is we did have someone type in an additional strategy, which I think is a really interesting one. Discrepant events, T. Gleam's material. That's a really interesting way to get kids to think about argumentation because they're intuitive events. We have someone else say listening. I don't know if Ephraim, Paul, did you want to elaborate on what you meant by that as a strategy for argumentation? I don't know if people can unmute themselves or we have to unmute them. Let me try this.
You can unmute yourself, bottom left.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes.
Okay, so what I meant by listening is a way whereby other people are given a chance to discuss what they think about the phenomenon, while others take the chance to listen and then understand from the perspective of the discussants. Then they can use that to build on their arguments.
Yeah, excellent. That's a really important attribute for students to do if they're going to engage in argumentation effectively. They have to be able to listen, be constructive in how they think about their arguments and think about others' arguments. Totally get that.
Mhm. I don't see any other questions in the chat box, but does anyone else, would anyone else like to say something or ask something? Okay, I think you can move on.
Yeah, we'll move on. So, yes, this is great. And what Donna talked about with claim evidence reasoning and what Paul brought up about argumentation and listening, we are kind of embedded within the framework of the model evidence link diagram, or the MEL diagram. And this is an example showing that. We do a little bit different twist on it, as Donna talked about. And what we do is we look at the connections between lines of evidence and two competing models about a phenomenon. So we'll break this down and unpack it for you in a little bit, but I just wanted to kind of give you an overview. The main thing here is that what we try to do is help students make these evaluations between connections between evidence and models. And so what we have is 4 types of arrows that the students can draw. They draw it from a line of evidence to a particular model. So they go from the evidence to the model. And that judgment is an evaluation that they make about how well the evidence supports a particular model. They do 2 of those from a line of evidence to each model. So there'll be a total of 8 if you have 4 lines of evidence and 2 models, which is kind of a fundamental framework that we use in our MEL diagrams. What this does is that it helps students to really think explicitly about what they're evaluating, how they're evaluating these connections between evidence and alternative models, and get them to reappraise their plausibility. And we'll show you what that means in a second. So this is kind of the overall framework of how it works. Something rather simple for the students to do. Our classroom observations show they really enjoy doing this. And we've also seen, as Paul was indicating, that people think deeply and they talk deeply and they talk richly. These students talk richly amongst each other. So just give you a little background about our project. We've actually had 2 projects that have been, that have been related. The first project we developed was a 3-year project, started about 6 years ago. And what we're investigating is kind of how students are evaluating. How are they reappraising plausibility, and are they learning? Are they gaining knowledge about these topics? And we started out by designing these model evidence link diagrams for the classroom. We involved an awesome group of master teachers. They got into it. They told us what they needed in the classroom, how they needed it, and they helped us design these materials as a research team. Then we went to their classrooms. We pilot tested. They came back with a lot of comments. We met together as a team, teachers and researchers, students, and we redesigned. And then we did it again for year 2. And then we did what we call a quasi-experimental design. And the overall research question was, how does this instruction promote explanations and knowledge changes about these earth and space science topics? So our first project, we did a lot of testing, hundreds of high school students. We had 8 master teachers led by Missy Holzer. And one of them was a district, or 2 of the districts were in this region of the country. And they were generally suburban districts with a relatively high socioeconomic status. And then we had a district in this region of the country, southwestern US, a relatively low socioeconomic status, large urban district. And what we found was very similar results in all the districts, which was interesting and exciting and good results. We developed 4 model evidence link diagrams that we now call the pre-constructed MELs. And they deal with the topic of causes of current climate change is one of them. The connection between hydraulic fracturing and earthquakes, the value of wetlands and resources to ecosystem services, and the formation of the Earth's moon. And these kind of cover broad areas in normative earth science curriculum, geology, hydrology, climate and weather, and astronomy. So when you teach the MEL, and we'll show you where to get these materials because they're available for free. We have an activity introducing the two alternative and competing models. So what we do is we kind of introduce it in the form of an argument. We kind of lay some phenomenon out. So in the case of current climate change is that global temperatures have been increasing, average sea levels have increased also, and then kind of come up with two arguments or two competing models, explanatory models of why this happens. One's a scientific model, and another model is a plausible but non-scientific alternative. So then what the students do before they start the diagram is they rate the plausibility. Students think in different ways. There's kind of these different categories of thinking that students make when they make these judgments. So some students reason based on probability. So what we've done is we have a phenomenon, we've given them two alternatives that explain that phenomenon. And if you're thinking probabilistically, if you rate one high, then you need to rate the other low because those are the two alternatives that accompany that. But what we find more often is that students think both are plausible. So what they do is they'll rate both relatively high. And this occurs most common. And sometimes, and occasionally, students will think both models are implausible. This is kind of a curious case where students are probably thinking about the two models, and they're thinking about another model as a comparison that maybe is more alternative. We haven't really done a lot of empirical investigation on that, but it's really a fascinating case.
Hey, Doug?
Yes.
Doug, you flew by poll 3, but it still might be applicable if you're interested, and that is the poll about.
Yeah, let's do that one.
Yeah.
Thanks for jumping in, Carla.
Sure.
So yeah, this is plausibility judgment. This is great. So we have 4 categories that we use in the model evidence linked diagram. The evidence supports the explanation. The evidence strongly supports the explanation. The evidence contradicts the explanation, or the evidence has nothing to do with the explanation. So just take a second. Thank you. All right, why don't we go ahead and reveal those results. Yeah, it's interesting. This is great. And you're very characteristic of what we see students do, what we see when we do our teacher trainings. There's usually a mix of evidence strongly supports and evidence contradicts. It turns out the biggest ones to change the plausibility judgment for students is when evidence contradicts the explanation. And it actually turns out that this is related to the history of science in a very strong way. Now, where individual scientists don't necessarily engage in kind of this plausibility reappraisal, the community of scientists does. And when there's contradictory evidence found, then they know that there's a really big flaw in the model. It either has to be reworked or that new model has to come up. So yeah, really great. Thank you. And thank you for going back to this, Carla. It's really fascinating. So I'll just shoot ahead to where I was. So we talked about the way that they rate the plausibility.
Doug?
Yeah.
We have a question. How do students define plausibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we do, and what I haven't shown you is this, is we, as we take students through the model plausibility ratings, prior to doing that, we have this one little task that teachers often do. It's called the plausibility ranking task, where we introduce the notion of plausibility and we introduce the notion of these ways to evaluate evidence and model connections. That's where we introduce the 4 arrows to the students first. And there we present a definition to the students about what plausibility is. Now, it's really interesting. in my experiences, and Donna and Missy, you can chime in, Carla too, that students have a really good inherent understanding of the plausibility judgment, actually sometimes better than adults. Adults will often default to this probabilistic notion, particularly scientists and science teachers. But students kind of think about it in a more coarse and qualitative way. And one of the things that we speculated on is we do know that the word plausible and implausible is introduced in language arts because it's part of the SAT lexicon. It's part of the SAT vocabulary words. So students seem to have a fairly good understanding of what plausibility is in a coarse way, but we introduce it in a task that we haven't shown here in the interest of time. After we go through these introductory tasks, students are ready to complete the model evidence link diagram. Before that, what we're finding though is what we like to do is we like to get students more information about the lines of evidence. So what we've developed is what we call evidence texts. And we've provided a one-page evidence text that provides more detail for each of the lines of evidence. And teachers approach the evidence text in different ways with their students. Sometimes they'll just require students to read it as a group. Sometimes they'll read it together as a whole group. Sometimes they'll have students read it individually. All of our evidence texts usually involve one or two diagrams and just some simple expository text in plain language, appropriate reading level for the students that kind of describes the nature of the data. So here's an example of two evidence texts from the climate change MEL, and there's evidence 3 and 4. So this is an example of a student completed diagram. And you can see this is the one that I've used in the example before. Like I said, students generally do this relatively well. Often they'll do it in the collaborative group setting. They really enjoy doing it. And then the end part is what we call the explanation task. And what students do here is they respond to these prompts and they pick 3 of the arrows that they draw and they just elaborate on them. This is really the meat, the bread and butter of the model evidence link diagram. The diagram is where they kind of do the work, but this is the area that you really get to see the students thinking, why did they draw the arrows that they drew? And this is really great. We recommend that this be used as a formative assessment for the students. It can also be used as in a summative assessment mode, and we've written an article about this. Elliot Bickel, a former undergraduate student here at Temple, helped me write this article to explain ways that you can assess how students do on the model evidence link diagram. And a matter of fact, this article is available for free, and I'll just take you quickly to the site. We had a whole special issue in the Earth Scientist that was devoted to the model evidence link diagram, and it was the summer 2016 issue. This is available for free online. And you can see we have several articles. I'll just take you to the, well, here's an example of the first article. It talks a lot about what we're talking about in this particular webinar. I wrote it, and it mainly features the climate change MEL. Let me just scroll down a little bit because I wanted to point out a feature here that's related. What we've done is we've connected all the model evidence link diagram to specific performance expectations from the NGSS. So you'll see here that, that we've connected 2 of the performance expectations to the climate change model evidence diagram. So these are handy tools. And the very last paragraph is the assessment one that we just talked about. So the sequence of activities with the MEL takes about 60 to 90 minutes of instruction time in the classroom. And this is the pre-constructed MELs. And again, just as a kind of a recap, we would do the plausibility ranking task before this, which one of the people raised a question about, but you don't have to do it every time. But every time we present students with the competing models, we have them rate the plausibility. Then we have them read and discuss the evidence text and complete the diagram. And then they complete the explanation task. Again, you can learn more about using the MEL in your classroom in this open access issue that I just showed you from the Earth Scientist. We have 5 articles. And I should say that many of the project team, master teachers, our undergraduate research assistants, graduate research assistants, and faculty researchers authored these articles. So it really was a team, a wonderful team effort, and I hope you can use them and find them usable. Before we go on, though, it might be a good time to just check the chat window for questions. Carla, is there anything out there that people have questions on?
Yes. Just a second, I was responding. Are these MEL diagrams typically used at a specific place in lesson unit design?
Yeah, that's a great question. Typically, they're done right at the beginning of the unit. What's important about this, and you'll read this, and if you read the first article, is that it's important that after the students kind of don't know up front necessarily what the scientific model is, but at the end of the activity, when you've completely finished with the MEL diagram, you'll want to explain to them what the scientific alternative is. You want to make it very clear that in the case of climate change, it's that the climate change consensus is that for human-induced climate change. So we highly recommend that. We highly recommend putting it at the beginning of the unit, although some teachers have used it in the middle, and they've actually used it towards the end as more of an assessment. Any other questions, Carla?
That's it right now.
Great. So what have we shown? We've done some really rigorous research, some great empirical work. We published this in research-intensive journals. And we found that students make really good scientific evaluations and learn about these topics more deeply. But what we're not seeing is transfer outside of the context of the actual activity, outside of the classroom. And that's kind of the holy grail of education, is we want students to be able to take what we teach them in the classroom and be able to take it out with them into the world. And so we want to do a better job with that. So we've got a new project. And what we're doing with this project is, after students have kind of engaged with the pre-constructed MEL, they're building what we call a baMEL, or build-a-MEL. And the idea here is that it increases students' conceptual agency. So when students who have conceptual agency in the classroom, they're kind of authors of their own contribution to their learning. They're accountable to other members of the classroom learning community, and they have the authority to think about and solve problems. And the build-a-MEL is kind of like Build-A-Bear, or it's kind of like Legos. And what we do is we provide 8 or 9 lines of evidence to students. They read through the evidence text, and they pick 4 to make their own MEL on this worksheet. Then we provide them 3 models, and they pick 2 of those. And one of them is the scientific model, 2 may be the non-scientific model. And that's what our current research project is working with, and we're testing these out in classrooms right now. So we've developed 4 more. They deal kind of with the basic same areas of geology, hydrology, climate, and astronomy. We developed one about the relationships between extreme weather and climate change. We've created one about the connection between fossils and Earth's past service and paleoclimates. One about the availability of freshwater resources, and another about the origin of the universe. So what we've been finding, we've just been doing our first full year of pilot testing in the classroom, kind of along that same model of design and testing that I showed you before. And they take a little bit about twice as long as the pre-constructed MEL that we showed you with climate change, maybe about 90 to 120 minutes, maybe more on the 1.5 times as opposed to twice as long. So what students do is we present them with 3 competing models, and they rate the plausibility of that. They read and discuss the 9 evidence texts, and they build the MEL, and then they complete an explanation task. And you'll see the explanation task is a little bit different. It's a little bit shorter. We're actually making some modifications to it now, getting it a little more focused and useful to the classroom. And we're developing a new rubric that is fully NGS aligned, so that when teachers look at students' responses on the explanation task, they can have a fully NGS aligned rubric. So we're getting near the end of our time. But before I open up to questions, I want to just point out that we do have a project website. You can get free access to all the instruction materials, all the resources that I've talked about. Let's just go visit it real quickly. You can see we give some general information about the project. And again, one of the things I failed to mention is we are supported by the National Science Foundation. I'm very grateful for their support. You can go to the link of teaching resources. So the climate change model evidence link diagrams that I showed you, the full suite of activities is here. Earthquakes and fracking, wetlands use, formation of the moon, and the assessment articles are all there. We've got a teacher's guide, and we've also got a link to the baMEL resources, the build-a-MEL resources that are currently under development. Although these are under development, the build-a-MEL resources, we encourage you to use them, provide feedback, send me an email, and let me know how it's going. Also on the website, we've developed a lot of professional development. We do teacher summer institutes. We do them in New Jersey and Georgia, our 2 project sites. And what you're able to access there, we have webinar information, we have materials from the summer institutes, we have follow-up webinars. You're able to view all those, and you're able to access the additional materials for professional development from the Summer Institute. We'd be happy to answer any questions about that.
Doug, if you just go back to the teaching resources, since you pointed out the articles in the teaching resources, if you click on any one of those, the article that was in the First Scientist is also clicked out there as a resource specific to that particular MEL.
Right, there it is. There it is, the article. We've got the handouts. We talk a little bit more about it. We've got some more student handouts. Right.
And Doug, we have a great question from Karen, who wants to know if we have any plans to engage students with real world materials like news articles or videos, or ask them to find their own to apply what we're teaching. And I think you've got a great answer for that.
Well, yeah, it's something we talked about a lot, and particularly, well, Donna, you really got a great answer about it because you talked about this quite a bit. What we've done in some of these associated, as you go to the website, you'll see that there are links to other resources, but we also encourage teachers when they use the MEL diagrams to find other available resources that students can use to learn about these lines of evidence, to learn about these possible explanatory models. And we know that some teachers do expand upon that. So those are fabulous and awesome. And we're also developing currently what we call the virtual MEL activity, which will be an electronic version of the MEL, and it will facilitate access to these videos, access to these other resources, access to real data, authentic scientific data, lines of data, much more readily. So we've been testing the scaffold. Now we're going to make the scaffold electronic, so it's available in the classroom. That's still in about 2 years in the developmental phase. Matter of fact, I just had a meeting on it earlier today. But hopefully that'll be of some use, particularly for classes that have good access to technology. What other questions do we have?
Did you talk about the transfer task?
Yeah, I was just going to say, maybe Missy
that's a
wants
great
to
one.
say
Yeah.
something about it.
Yeah, thanks, Donna. Talk about that'd be great if you could. Well, you know who's the best to talk about the transfer task? I wonder if you'd be willing. Would be Missy Holzer. Missy, would you be willing? Are you still on?
She doesn't have a microphone.
Oh, that's a shame.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so we're developing a transfer task too that also looks, what we'd have students do is these are current articles. Thank you for reminding me. I just totally missed that. But these are current articles from the science literature that are at the appropriate reading level for students in secondary and even middle school. And we have students work with that to find alternative explanations, to find lines of evidence, and to think about the basic construction, the basic principles behind the MEL in that transfer task. We're just developing that. We're going to make that available this summer, and that'll be available on the website soon. What else did I miss?
Oh, well, Doug, we have another question from
Yeah.
Jessica. Do you think this instructional model is as effective for topics that aren't as controversial in chemistry or physical science, for example?
Oh, that's a great question. Originally, if you had asked me that about 5 years ago, I would have said, oh yeah, it'll work for even abstract concepts. But what we're finding is it probably does not work as well unless there's some kind of embedded controversy. Now, it may not be a full-blown controversy, but it may be that pitting one alternative against another does not work as well if the students don't find the topic to be controversial. We've done some testing of that, and really what we don't see is the same level of engagement or the same level of knowledge understanding after they do the activities. So I'm hesitant to say no because I really thought that it would work for just basic complex tasks, but it may be that it may not work for. One of the things that I thought about was like in physical science for like just basic notions of motion, like do objects stay at rest naturally, or do objects stay in motion? Kind of a people think that objects come to rest naturally is kind of a misconception about Newton's first law. Turns out the model evidence link diagram probably won't be appropriate in that. So it's not a silver bullet, is what I'm trying to say.
Before on, I would like to let everyone know if you are going to be in St. Louis for the National Science Teachers Association Conference this next month, that Missy and I will be presenting the MEL Project and some of the activities that you just saw on Saturday, April 13th at 2 p.m. in the afternoon.
I will add to that, I believe, Donna and Missy, that you'll also be sharing the sort of board game version at the Share-a-thons. Is that correct?
We will. One of us will be at one of the Share-a-thons. Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
It's a busy time.
At each of the Share-a-thons. Let me clarify.
Yes. We do have another question. How willing are students to abandon their preconceived notions regarding the validity of a model?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it doesn't work for every student every time. I'll tell you that right now, but it works for a lot of students, or most of the students most of the time. So particularly if you approach the model evidence link diagram without telling them up front what the scientific explanatory model is, students then get engaged in a really rich discussion, particularly if they're involved in collaborative groups. What I've found, because I know there's a lot of concerns about adverse emotions that are activated by controversy, anger, frustration, things like that. What we found, I don't have exact empirical evidence to do this, but I have it in a related project, is that when students engage in these evaluations, while they're doing the activity and they're doing the task, it tends to dampen those negative emotions that aren't productive to learning. What it does is it tends to highlight the emotions that are more conducive to learning, like curiosity. It begins to look at a spark of interest. We find that students are fairly well motivated. The one concern that we do have is that this is fairly taxing on them thinking-wise. So just be aware that it's a brain bender, and that's why I have SpongeBob on there, like that. Students can get tired doing this. It's a cognitive challenge for a lot of them, but what we find is the time goes fast for the students, and that most of the students generally enjoy it quite a bit.
Thank you, Doug. I think we have answered pretty much everyone's questions, so I'd like to give folks an opportunity to take the survey. So Andrew, if you can display the last few slides and you put the survey in there. Wonderful.
Yeah, share. There you go.
So we do have a post-webinar survey, and we really, really appreciate it if you can fill this out. We have, we use this to improve our webinars and also as a means of assessing the effectiveness of what we're trying to accomplish here with this implementing NGSS in the Earth Sciences Initiative. So please do take a few minutes right now to complete the survey. Andrew has put the link in the chat window. And if you can advance to the next slide. I'll just remind everyone again that on April 18th at 4 p.m. we have Wiki Watersheds and the NGSS presented by Steve Curlin from the Stroud Water Research Center. And again, there's the URL where you can go and look at our previous webinars. So I would like to thank everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I really appreciate having everybody and your interest, and love to hear from you, and please feel free to email.
Okay. And with that, please do complete the survey. You've got 8 minutes left in the hour. Do it now before you forget. Thank you.